to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. This week, I'm your solo co-host, just your host, I think, maybe what they call it, Matt Bernico. Hi. Dean is away at COP30 this week, doing his big job, bearing witness to all of the weirdness that kind of comes with COP. We talked a bit about that last time, and I'm sure we'll talk about what happened there in the coming episode in the future. This week, however, while Dean's away, the Protestants will play. That's right, folks. I've got William Gibson on the show, friend of the pod. He's been on the past to talk about student Christian movement stuff. And this time he's back to talk about the World Communion of Reformed Churches. That's right. When the Catholics are out doing their thing, we're going to be in here talking about Reformed Christianity and what that big meeting looks like. A pretty cool conversation. So you'll find out in the episode, but William was just at the World Communion of Reformed Churches out in Thailand, and throughout this episode, we talk about what it was like to be with so many Christians from around the world. We talk about Christian unity, TikTok, unionizing Apple stores, and anti-fascist Christ the King Sunday. Man, a lot of great stuff in this episode. So anyways, real Protestant hours over here. Buckle up. This week on the show, we have William Gibson. William's been on in the past to talk about SCM and some anti-war stuff. This time, he's back to talk about something different, but instead of me trying to encapsulate every single thing that he's going to talk about, because I have a big, long list, I'll let William introduce himself and tell us what he's all about. So, William, remind us, you've been on the show before, but you can give everyone a refresher on who you are and what you're about.
I suppose primarily in relation to this podcast, I'm one of your hiking companions here in Scotland, which is always good fun getting to do that and convincing some of our other friends of a good way of looking at the world. So, my name's William Gibson. I'm a student minister in the Church of Scotland, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. Researching specifically Church of Scotland in the 1960s, looking at things like secularization, mission, and ecclesiology. I've been on the podcast before, yes, talking about some of the work that I did with the student Christian movement here in the UK, as I worked for them for a year before I started my training for ministry, and also talked a little bit then about one of the chapters that I've had published talking about theology and trade unions, as I used to work at Apple and helped to unionize the Apple store in Glasgow. So I think that's enough for just now.
A man of many talents. He's walking up mountains. He's unionizing Apple stores. He's going to grad school. Insane. A crazy amount of things. On top of all those things, you just got back from the World Communion of Reformed Churches meeting in Thailand, where thousands, I would imagine, of Christians from the Reformed tradition all met together. We're big fans on internationalism on this podcast, especially when it comes to big groups of Christians meeting from around the world. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that meeting and what it was like?
Yeah, of course. It was in Chiang Mai in Thailand, which is up the north of Thailand, if you don't know where it is on a map. So surrounded by mountains, surrounded by jungles, absolutely beautiful. Loved my time there, but I was invited to the World Communion of Reformed Churches as a consultant. So I was doing a workshop there on social media, AI and creativity through a Reformed theology lens. And as well as that, I was helping with the youth caucus. So it was a group of around about, I think, 40 young Christians. There were more than that, but a lot of them were volunteering as stewards or had been there as part of the Global Institute of Theology. So they weren't necessarily all participating in the youth caucus. But for those who were there as delegates from their member churches, they were involved in that, which was the first 2 days. And then after that, I was involved with the communications team doing social media and photography, which was great fun. There was a really good team of people from all over for that. But the World Communion is made up of about 100 million Christians from over 230 member churches in 109 countries. And it was the 150th anniversary of the Communion. It was originally established as the Alliance of the Reformed Churches throughout the world holding the Presbyterian system. I know that's a bit hard to fit into an acronym, but that was the name originally, set up in 1875. It was mainly churches from North America and Europe at that time. And then this alliance joined with the International Congregational Council in 1970 to form the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and then took on its current form in 2010 when it joined with the Reformed Ecumenical Council to become the World Communion of Reformed Churches. So the reason that we were there was that we were at the General Council, which meets every 7 years. And so you have delegates that come from member churches and they come together to discern the will of God for the communion. And it's a really interesting process actually about how they do this, but it's in relation to things like politics, in relation to economics, in relation to theology, the church, the role of the church, the place of mission, about inclusion within the church, whether that be hearing the voices of Indigenous people. There was an Indigenous report of people with disabilities. And it was just great to hear such a diversity of voices and topics being discussed with a reformed lens. And it also involves electing leadership. But the way that this is done is through a process of discernment and consensus. So the discernment process involves three different types of sessions. It was listening, discerning, and deciding. Usually the listening session would be a presentation by theologians or ministers or people with lived experience of a particular topic. So, for example, there was a listening session on justice, there was a listening session on mission, and that would usually be a couple of hours where we get to hear from people who are experts and then ask questions. It didn't always work out like that, just with timings and with big events like this, nothing ever runs to schedule. But then after that, you basically quite quickly go into discernment groups, which are much smaller groupings. So rather than being with the hundreds of delegates in the room, you're put into groups of around about 20 people. And in that, you discuss some of the things that came up in those listening sessions and any of the reports that have been put forward. And then you come back together again for a final deciding session where you kind of put together the details and you finalize what is going to be said in each of the reports. And the way that they decide that is through consensus. So you don't vote in the traditional sense. It's not like 300 voted yes and 250 voted no. You're given blue and orange cards. Blue indicates disagreement and orange indicates agreement. And so if there's a unanimous decision, then it passes if it's all orange cards. And if the moderator sees even one blue card, they're invited to speak as to why they disagree. They can offer an amendment. They can just state disagreement. And then if there's no consensus at that point and they're asked if they want to move on or if they're happy to move on, if they feel that they've been heard. And then if there's still no consensus at that point, then it would go to a vote. So it was really interesting to see, as someone not coming from a tradition that practices that form of consensus or decision making. Sometimes if you look at something like the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, it can feel confrontational on certain issues where you, especially when it's close votes. There was one on assisted dying earlier this year at the General Assembly that was a very close decision based off an amendment to a statement from the church, which felt quite bitter at points, is how I viewed it personally and from some of the people that I spoke to who were there. But yeah, and these decisions aren't binding for member churches. The WCRC can't enforce these decisions, but what it stands to do is really be a prophetic voice and give churches maybe the confidence to speak on some of the things that maybe they wouldn't have thought of before, and also to hear the voice of Christians from other places who are raising particular concerns or experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that they're engaging in that type of, I don't know, mostly consensus decision making. Is there like is there Presbyterian backing for that, or is that just unique to this organization in particular?
There were quite a few denominations that were there who have basically always used consensus. I think in particular, I was speaking to someone from one of the United churches in Australia, where there's quite a lot of indigenous people that are a part of the church, and they were telling me that they've basically always used consensus. So
Oh,
a lot of kind of non-Western denominations had been using it, and others had decided to adopt it after the last General Council introduced it in 2017. That was the first time it was done in the WCRC, and some other denominations have adopted it. So it was really interesting to see.
feel like I'm kind of a policy and process nerd a lot of times, so I'm always really interested in hearing how people make decisions like that. So that sounds great. Well, what were some of the big decisions that were made? Like anything? I mean, you said they're non-binding, which is fine. They don't have to be binding, but uh, people who are in the in the world community of Reformed churches, what can they expect? What are the hottest things coming out of this big meeting this year?
There was a lot of really interesting stuff. It's hard to pick just a couple to highlight. Actually, you can read a lot of the reports online. So if you were to go and read them, I'd recommend you do that. If you're fascinated in this stuff like I am. But I mean, some of the stuff that came out that stood out to me was one of the statements on sexuality, which it's quite a big statement, but if I could summarize it, it would basically be a commitment to a principle of non-harm. So even though there was disagreement amongst member churches about inclusion or affirmation, there was an agreement on the principle of not harming people of different sexual identities. So that was interesting, and the debates were quite tense for that, to
Mm,
be honest, as you would probably expect. Um, Similarly, I think one of the really good things about the WCRC is just a really strong commitment to the ordination of women. I believe close to, this is just off the top of my head, I believe close to 90% of the member churches ordain women. But I mean, the Women's Caucus brought forward a report, and in that they were basically trying to say that we should be encouraging more member churches to actually be ordaining women like in practice, not just in
right.
principle. Because even though a majority, like almost close to all of the member churches ordain women, I think it was something like 30 to 40% of ordained ministers in the member churches are women. So still a way to go in terms of actually implementing these decisions in member churches. As I said, though, they're not binding, so none of the churches can be forced to do anything about this. But it does kind of hold a mirror up to them to say, look at what's going on here. Look at what the Spirit of God is doing across the world in similar churches to yours in different situations. So that was a good one too. There was lots of really great stuff on the environment, on the climate, especially because you have the voices of people whose island communities are disappearing into the sea as we speak, who spoke very forcefully. And it was great to hear a really strong witness on climate, really strong witness on disability and disability theology. Um, and then also on economics, there was a strong condemnation of the current economic global order that exists and the injustices that it creates.
Love to hear it. Love to hear when people are mad about capitalism. That's great. Is that language that people would have used at the conference? Like, would they have used the phrase capitalism in particular, or would they say like the inequality in the world, or some stand-in for it?
No, I mean, capitalism was mentioned pretty openly, very regularly, and a lot of the people that are heard from in terms of the listening sessions, especially, were very anti-capitalist in their approach and very much condemning neoliberalism too. So it was interesting to see that because I think there can be a lot of debate about that in maybe the West, but it's like really not up for debate in a lot of other places from the conversations that I was having anyway. That was the perception that I got, is that for
Yeah.
many people that are not in Western countries, like this is just part of the Christian witness as being anti-capitalist.
Mm. Well, there's a lot we could probably talk about that, and maybe we can bring some of it back in a bit. But you were there. That was interesting. I was following you on TikTok and like watching or seeing all the cool pictures you're posting on Instagram. Great stuff. I want to go to Thailand. It looks pretty amazing. Um, on your TikTok, people are always okay. I like your TikToks a lot, William, because I don't know. You're you're a normal person saying normal things about religion, and then people lose their minds at whatever you're saying, and that is great. I love that. Well, I don't love it for you. I'm sure it's probably very stressful and annoying, but I do like seeing it. It's very entertaining. But I guess there was a TikTok that you posted right after you came back from the WCRC, um, where I don't know. Basically, you were talking about Christian unity and sort of the ways that people can speak for other Christians in ways that are like harmful and arrogant and stuff. And that's really interesting to me. So, I mean, you were just at this big, huge Christian event, and you're talking about consensus decision making, but also like the tense conversations that people are having. What does Christian unity look like in that scope? Like how does that work out in your brain?
Yeah, it's really interesting. TikTok's definitely a test for me when it comes to my principles of Christian unity. So honestly, think I was saying to someone the other day that like some of the comments that you get, like the amount of times that you write a response and it's one of the best. Like if you're into sarcasm as humor, like I have a treasure trove of sarcastic comments that have never been posted because it's just a test in patience and in not saying anything and really trying to see the best in what people are saying and actually trying to understand what's going on. So I hope that comes across in the videos that I do on there. But the particular video I had in mind, I see a lot of the time online a lot of apologists of all banners of all types, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, whatever it is, who just come across as very arrogant and certain of their position, their tradition, without really any interest in truly listening to one another. So it was interesting in the context of the WCRC to see what was considered polarizing. As I already mentioned, there was a fairly broad agreement when it came to things like capitalism and anti-capitalism, and the contentious issues were sexuality, gender, Christian Zionism, and Palestine. So maybe some of the issues that are seen as contentious in society obviously have spilled over into there. As Christians, we're not immune to those influences. But one night I was with a few friends when we were sharing some of our frustration about the lack of progress that we had made on saying anything substantial in solidarity with Palestine due to disagreements between different groups of people. But one of the members of the leadership team just kept saying to us that they are not the enemy. And we went on to discuss the need to recognize that the systems of injustice and oppression are the enemy, and to recognize each other as potential friends that we can win over and discuss with, which actually made me think about some of my experience of unionizing within Apple, because one of the mistakes that we made was failing to recognize that this sort of group called leads, that were supervisors, were actually eligible to be part of our bargaining group, basically. And so we didn't even think to talk to them and kind of viewed them as opposition almost. And so actually, when it came to trying to then win them over, that discussion became a lot harder later on because we'd already kind of designated them as being with the sort of bosses, basically, when actually they were on the same type of contract as we were. They were being paid very similarly to us. And it's one of the principles of both community and union organizing is one-to-one conversations. And that actually a lot of the people that were expressing concern or wanting to bring up amendments or change things were people that when you had conversations with one-on-one would begin to open up about why that was, and oftentimes it would be rooted in some sense of ignorance or having not heard another perspective, just because obviously when you are coming from a particular tradition you're often immersed in it. And one of the things that I've reflected on afterwards is just how maybe, and with all my training for ministry just now within the Church of Scotland, how inward looking I was with the church and failing to see maybe what was going on in the Reformed tradition across the globe. So actually those one-on-one conversations were really powerful. And it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm probably going to butcher the quote here and trying to remember it, but he said something along the lines of, if you love your idea of community, then you're bound to destroy it. But if you love the person in front of you, then that's where you'll build community. So I think actually unity can be found in building community, in community organizing, and actually taking action that tackles injustices and creates community. And that's a hard task, but I think it's a very worthwhile one. And I don't think that that means that you then back down on topics like Palestine, for example. Like in the end, the statement approved by the General Council on Palestine called on member churches to reject Christian Zionism, to get member churches to call on their governments to do more to support the rebuilding of Gaza, to give money towards that. There was a lot of good things within it, although it maybe wasn't as strong a statement as I would have hoped for. Actually, that whole process of being very frustrated whenever it came up for days and days and days. And then just at the very end, after there'd been more discussion, more conversation, there was a much stronger statement that came out as a result of those discussions together.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you put it that way, because I mean, something that I think people involved in socialist politics, left-wing politics writ large, and also people who are involved in like Christian theological discussions have something they have in common is the ways that they are really quick to write off people who they perceive as their enemies. You know, it's like, oh, well, you don't hold the proper party line. You're a heretic about this thing in particular. But like you're demonstrating, you know, even people who, you know, might disagree with you on some things are willing to go pretty far away with you on other things, you know, when it comes to supporting, I don't know, Palestine or trans people or whatever, you know, just an interesting observation about the ways that Christianity works, or just an organization can work when you're focused on results, action, and justice rather than sort of a particular ideological position or something. I don't know. Very cool. Well, maybe more on that. I was looking through some of the World Communion of Reformed Churches documents that came out of the meeting, and I didn't look at them all. So my homework is lacking. So I read some of like the top level messaging around the themes that were central to the WCRC. And a big theme that came through was actually about unity, which makes sense given that the meeting is such an expansive sort of bringing together different people. But I was interested because it was a type of unity that was centered on like a just future. And I guess, I don't know, what were your observations about that particular connection that, you know, I mean, like I was saying, maybe ideology is hard sometimes, but justice is a little bit easier to negotiate between people. I don't know. How did that work out at the meeting?
Yeah, well, I think there was a recognition that there's no unity without justice. There was this really powerful moment, and I really can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but I believe it was the former moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Ghana. And he was speaking in one of the listening sessions, and he used the analogy of how on slave ships during the colonial era, that on the upper deck you would have these slave traders who would be singing hymns and having services and hearing the screams of people below in the lower decks, of the pain that they were in, of their mourning, their grief, the trauma of all of it. And he used that analogy to talk about that if we refuse to truly be a just communion, and what you end up with as member churches in the upper deck, aka the West, singing hymns and going to church on a Sunday and being happy in their doctrinal statements, being happy in their position that they take, thinking that, oh well, we've produced a statement, that's enough. But actually below deck, in the majority world, you have people screaming and the church is refusing to hear. And I just thought it was a really powerful analogy that stuck with me throughout the whole thing, is just that need that there really can't be unity without justice, because if there's no justice, and there's no opportunity for reconciliation where there has been wrong done, in which case there can never be true community.
That is really powerful. that reminds me a lot of a often repeated Leonardo Boff, I don't know, parable or something that he has in multiple of his books. The picture he paints, though, is, I mean, it's about ecology and colonialism, which is, I mean, not dissimilar from what you're talking about. But basically, he's describing the planet as a spaceship, right? And there's just a few people who get to live sort of in luxury, and everyone else is in the cargo hold, rattling around with, like, you know, the cargo. But yeah, I don't know, very powerful. I think a good framing, something that I wish a lot of other Christians would maybe figure out, but pretty difficult. Being you know, you're in grad school, you're on the route to become sort of an ordained person in the Church of Scotland. How is this affecting that part of your life? How you're thinking about ministry, how you're thinking about, I don't know, being a pastor. What is this changing for you?
I think it's probably just made me more confident in what I already sensed as part of what I believe to be my call in ministry, which is speaking for justice, because I believe that justice is central to the gospel. I'm an Iona community member, and the Iona community is an ecumenical organization centered around common concerns rather than necessarily shared beliefs. So you have Quakers and Catholics and Baptists and Presbyterians like myself, who come together and work for justice. They do justice, and they do that focusing on concerns like Palestine, like the climate, like economic justice. That doesn't necessarily mean it always works out that way, but one of the things that I love about the IOTA community is that there's a sense of accountability there, because as a full member, each year you meet with other members, and we account for our use of our time, our talents, and our money. And that's not to come along in a sort of wagging your finger sort of way saying you've not done enough, but providing a space to be honest about where you believe God is calling you to act justly, to be merciful, to love others, to actually live out the gospel of justice and peace. And so that's always been a strong part of my calling. And so actually going to the World Communion and meeting with Christians from Lebanon, from Syria, from Trinidad and Tobago, from Indonesia, from all over, and in many countries where Christianity is in the minority in terms of demographics, actually has just made that sense so much stronger, because whenever I think of injustices, I now think of the people that I've met who are living through those injustices, maybe in situations that hadn't taken up as much of my attention as they should have before. So that was really powerful for me. And I think actually it's really strengthened my commitment to ecumenical work in general. I think that Western churches, especially mainline Western churches, as they continue to decline numerically and financially, maybe have the risk of backing away from ecumenical relationships because they don't have enough money, or they need to be focused internally and looking at their own issues and sorting out what's going on there. And I actually think that would be a mistake, because these environments, like the WCRC, like the World Council of Churches and other ecumenical organizations and bodies, they provide the space for us to recognize the sort of Catholicity of the church, the universal nature of the church, and to recognize the truth of the fact that when one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. When one part rejoices, the whole body rejoices. And right now, a lot of the body is suffering. And if we don't recognize that, then we've cut ourselves off from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a Sri Lankan liberation theologian named Tissa Balasuriya who wrote a book called Planetary Theology, and it's a cool book. Think about it a lot. I probably need to read it more, but read it more than I think about it. But there's a bit in the book where he talks about he makes kind of this like funny flip where churches in the global north are often thinking about how they can better do missions to the global south. He thinks that, well, the global south needs to think about how they can actually bring the gospel to the global north, because the relationship of injustice is so stark that, like, the people in the global north need somebody from the global south to come point out exactly like the imbalance of consumption and production and the ways that these things are connected. So I don't know, that makes sense to me, what you're saying. Being with Christians from places that are ostensibly in the global south, is there anything that like really sticks out to you from that relationship, from that encounter? Anything that maybe was surprising to you, or that you are going to bring back and make other people pay attention to?
I think just the severe lack of non-Western theologians in our education here. And I mean, the University of Glasgow in general is probably better than some others. But I mean, although there are some great theologians to study within the Western tradition, there is such a depth um, and richness that exists within theology that is non-Western theology that I just think is lacking significantly in the Western church. And I think we have the sort of go-tos that where people who want to maybe appear like they're actually reading non-Western theologians go to, whether that is someone like Gustavo Gutierrez or Boff. And like we kind of point to these and go like, oh yes, I know what I'm talking about here. I've done my part in pointing to someone from a non-Western theological standpoint. But actually, when you consider the fact that the majority of Christians are coming from the majority world in the global south, we have still such a lack of non-Western theologians that are in our educational curriculum, and I think that needs to be addressed. And it's one of the things that came up for me was just as I listened, you just saw that there was this whole other world that like I hadn't even engaged with in terms of theology, and I think it's something that I'll continue to push for within the Church of Scotland and within training here as well.
Cool. Yeah, such a good thing to point out that Gustavo Gutierrez is very cool, like a legitimately great theologian, very interesting person. But people will just kind of say, they'll quote something that he says but not really consider the ramifications or the bigger picture. And I don't know, sometimes I've been guilty of that too, of just thinking like, oh, he's this sort of like radical anti-capitalist kind of guy. But you don't kind of pick up the bigger picture that, he has his theology is great. It's interesting. But like the bigger picture is that the capitalist world is underdeveloping the global south. And like that is an integral part of the theology itself. But that is often left out for, good quotes or something. Always very frustrating.
And I think as well, it maybe comes back to this sense of structural fundamentalism in some churches where like, I know that within a lot of kind of mainline denominations, there's like theological liberty where you can have in the one denomination fairly conservative viewpoints alongside fairly sort of liberal viewpoints, if you want to put it that way. But actually the structure and the end goal is never questioned. I think, as you said, in regards to mission, like when a lot of global north Christians are thinking about mission, it's about how can we do it too. Whereas there was one of the sessions I went to with Reverend Dr. Peniel Rufus, and it was one of the first ones at the Youth Caucus, and it was just a Bible study, but it stuck with me. And actually, I wrote a blog kind of using the imagery that he talked about in that to reflect on the WCRC as a whole when he was reflecting on the story of Jonah. And he described it rather than witnessing, it was witnessing. So it was viewing mission as the act of being together, of solidarity, of being with people, and recognizing that something like Jonah can't be reduced, like many theologians have done before in the West, to a sort of mini proto-gospel of just mapping onto the death and resurrection of Jesus, but rather it's a form of sort of messy missiology where Jonah in the belly of the fish just regurgitates the liturgies and prayers of
Mm.
the ancient Israelite community. It doesn't sound, if you read it, like really authentic or heartfelt. It was just like, oh well, like I'm just going to pray these prayers that I've always known, and but God still meets Jonah there. And actually, something that I'd never thought about was that it wasn't necessarily self-centeredness that stopped Jonah from going to Nineveh, but actually a sense of nationalism, because Nineveh was part of ancient Assyria, and the Assyrians were enemies of Israel, and so there's a sense of nationalism that seeps in there. So actually, it's much more messy and complicated than a lot of people would like it to be, and I've heard it preached before in a way of trying to guilt trip I mean, in the evangelical churches that I used to go to, as a teenager, I've heard Jonah used as a way of sort of guilt tripping people into sharing their faith and being bold for Jesus and things like that. And like, I mean, I love talking about faith, and but in the way that it's done, I think, as you say, it's like talking at people rather than talking with people. Um, so it's just been good to get that sort of different perspective on it.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes sense. It reminds me, this is a extremely Glasgow narrowcasting, but there's always this street preacher on Sashi Hall Street who's shouting at everybody. Man, I was down there and my son was with us, and he was just like, what is happening? He had no context for what this guy was shouting about, and just like very, very weirded out that he was talking about Jesus's blood, and just like, what is going on?
Yeah. I know. Well, I mean, when I used to work in Apple, it was one of the banes of my life was the fact that on a Saturday, it just felt like you had every religion and political party out there, but the ones that were always the loudest were the street preachers, because they would come along with the whole sound system and everything, and often be playing music that was heavily distorted because it was a really crappy sound system. But then, obviously, like you said, be shouting a lot about blood and sin and hell. And I actually remember one time, it was the middle of summer, which in Scotland is a lovely warm 17 degrees Celsius at that time. I say at that time because this summer we had a couple of 30-degree days, which I've not seen, and that's concerning. But yeah, it was about 17, 18 degrees. So I had a short sleeve shirt on. I'm walking along, and I get up and I see this street preacher, and he's actually not on the microphone. He was having a conversation with a guy off to the side. So I start listening to their conversation, and they're debating evolution.
Oh no.
And so I at this point I just kind of deconstructed from evangelicalism, and was amazed at all these new theological discoveries I was finding outside of the world of evangelicalism, and so decided to interject myself into the conversation and realize that the guy I was speaking to was an atheist. And then the street preacher started focusing on arguing with me as a as a Christian, and I think, like you said, it was just talking at me. Like, he didn't hear a single thing I was saying, even though I was coming into the conversation as a Christian. And he resorted to just saying that I looked effeminate in my short sleeved shirt. But long story short, the atheist and I went for coffee afterwards and became friends. So that was good fun.
Amazing. Very funny. I don't want to say that you deserve to be yelled at, but you're engaging with them. You can't give that to them. You can't do that. You can't engage with these guys. I
mean, I may have like deconstructed from the theology at that point in time, but I hadn't deconstructed from the sort of approach of like apologetics and trying to prove prove things rationally to people.
Definitely. Well, I've been there. Let's change gears here a little bit. Apart from all of the great reformed conversations that we've been having, you've also been writing a few articles for a new magazine called Shibboleth, which is a cool one, and I don't actually subscribe to it currently. I keep telling myself I need to subscribe to it. I follow them on Instagram, and they messaged the podcast once, and they said, "Hey, I think we're doing the same thing. We should chat about it sometime." And then I said, "Yeah, email me," and then they never did. So as soon as they email me, I will definitely subscribe to the magazine. I'm happy to do that. No, I'll probably do it before that. But Shibboleth is a cool UK-based, I think it's print-only magazine, but it highlights a lot of the themes around Christianity and politics. And I mean, yeah, it would not be dissimilar to the things that you're hearing in this podcast, I'm sure. But you've written two pieces for them, and one was about your trade union experience at Apple, and then the other one was about anti-fascism and Christ the King Sunday. So do you want to tell us about those exciting things?
Yeah, so Shibboleth only started up, I believe, earlier this year. But they've got 5 issues out now, and this one is on the topic of work. And really enjoyed writing. I met some of the editors at Greenbelt Festival last year, and we started discussing it. And then that's kind of how the invitation came up, which was great. But I wasn't too sure what I was going to write because I've already wrote the chapter on unionizing in Apple that's in Awake, Emerging and Connected as the book. So took a slightly different approach with this article and reflecting on maybe some of the mistakes that we made during unionizing, specifically around the union that we organized with, and some of the mistakes around not taking action fast enough when it came to actually engaging with other stores and things like that to actually make it a wider national movement and things. So it was a bit of reflection for me for the first half of it. And then the second half was more talking about the relevance of trade unions to community organizing and the importance of community organizing as a skill, especially within churches, that will be needed to counter the rise of far-right politics and fascism. And interestingly, I was able to fit in a quote from some of my archival research that I've been doing for my PhD. So I've spent a lot of time in the General Assembly records of the Church of Scotland, looking at reports from the 1960s. And there was this one about events promoting trade unions within the church in the 1950s and talking about the place and value. And there was a deliverance accepted unanimously by the Presbytery of Hamilton in 1955, which said that Christian workers, in their own interests and in the interests of others, should accept greater responsibility and show an interest in their trade unions, with particular reference to the important and often vital office of shop steward. I just thought that was great, and I think we need more of that. So I just really wanted to get that quote into this. But yeah, I mean, I'm not too sure what the deal is with being able to ship internationally, if they do that, or if it is just UK only. But I'm sure the answer will probably be on their website if people are interested in that. And they do post some of the articles online as a kind of taster for you to get. So I'd recommend doing that too. There's some really great stuff within it. But as I said, the other article I was doing was on Christ the King Sunday, aka Anti-Fascist Sunday. It's a very short article, that one. It was mainly just to try and encourage people to take the opportunity on the 23rd of November, which is Christ the King Sunday, to focus on maybe some of the anti-fascist elements of it. If you've not heard of this before, Christ the King Sunday was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius, and it wasn't necessarily a direct response to fascism, and it wasn't the only reason that this was made a feast day. But if you take into consideration the fact that in 1922, Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. In 1923, you have the Beer Hall Putsch in Germany. In 1925, Mein Kampf is published. And in the UK, in 1923, the Fascisti become the first openly fascist party in Britain. There is this sense of rising far-right sentiment in Europe. So actually the timing of it is very relevant. And Pope Pius described fascism as an ideology which resolves itself into becoming a true pagan worship of the state. And I think that's really powerful and relevant. And I think with the current political climate, especially in the West, in Europe, and North America, there is a need to address that. And so that's what I try and encourage people to do in that article. And I think there's a need for some more anti-fascist liturgy as well.
Yeah, sounds good to me. That sounds really cool. I like Christ the King Sunday as sort of an anti-fascist church moment. Uh, there's so much good. There's a time in my life where the idea of Christian anarchism was like really exciting to me, and I'm kind of past that now. But there's still so much anti-statist sort of currents within Christianity that are too good to pass up, and I think that's great to activate those when it comes to the rise of the far right. That makes a lot of sense. Man, I would love to talk more about the Apple piece though, and unionization and Christianity. That's such an interesting thing. In the U.S., there's I think a lot of energy, not a lot of energy. There is some energy around the community organizing aspect of Christianity, and when it comes to labor stuff. Like any big strike or big mobilization around labor usually has some kind of faith community behind it. Like that's just kind of in the playbook, I think, of a lot of trade unionists in America. If you read somebody like Jane McAlevey or whatever, any other sort of like labor strategy people, they're always going to tell you that it's great to have churches at your back. But I don't see that as much in the trade unionism of today in the UK, which is I think too bad. Definitely, I mean, it happened in the past. I mean, like Clydeside's full of it. There's all kinds of like churches and kind of radical figures coming out of Christianity for different trade unionist kinds of things. I don't know why. Why do you think that is? Is it just the sort of waning power of Christianity in Europe, or something else?
I think is maybe part of it is maybe just that the UK and European countries are a couple of decades ahead of the US in terms of secularization. I mean, this is part of my research is looking at secularization and how the Church of Scotland responds to this in the 1960s. One of the main theories around secularization is the idea of a decline of association, that one of the factors that contributes to the decline of churches in the UK and in maybe not elsewhere, but it does seem to happen elsewhere as well, is this decline of association with community organizations or voluntary organizations, whether that be churches, community groups, community councils, trade unions, political activist groups, things like that. I think more it's maybe not completely convincing, especially when you look at some of the big kind of anti-war movements that have happened here, the organization around protests for Palestine in the UK and things. I don't find it as convincing an argument, but I think it's a factor for sure, is that there's this general decline of association. And I think that the trade union movement in the UK has been maybe more thoroughgoing and basically declaring itself to be a more of a secular movement, even though it finds its roots in 19th century Christianity with the Tolpuddle martyrs. You see it at the founding of the Independent Labour Party. And you see, it's really interesting. You see some political activists who end up going into ministry, and you see some ministers that end up going into political work as well. So there's this really interesting crossover, especially in the early 20th century, around the ideas of Reconstruction after World War I and things like that. But it's unfortunate, and I think that the trade union movement and the church would both benefit if they learn to better support one another. Churches, in terms of buildings, are great spaces that trade unions could use for meetings and for organizing. And churches have a lot to learn from trade unions in terms of community building and organizing and working for justice. And similarly, there's lots of Christian movements that could teach the trade union movement a thing or two about that too. So I think it would be mutually beneficial to have that stronger relationship without necessarily needing to say that the trade union movement should go back to what it was as a kind of explicitly Christian movement in the 19th century. It needs to be inclusive of other faiths too.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It just it seems like there is the opportunity for a lot of synergy between Christianity as it exists in the UK and the trade union movement, like two social organizations that are like waning in power because of the rise of the far right and years of neoliberalism and all kinds of other things. It seems like there's like a more connections to be made there. Well, maybe something to think about in the future. Before we run out of time, I do want to ask you about your big TikTok channel because it's very cool, and I want people to watch them because I think they're very interesting. But yeah, you have a great TikTok channel when you're kind of highlighting your experiences in the Church of Scotland today, which is great because that's probably also a corner of Christianity that people have no clue about. I was wondering if you want to talk about that more as a person who's going into ministry. Like, do people within the Church of Scotland look at you as like, oh, this is the TikTok guy, he's gonna really do social media for us, or is there another impetus for it? Like, I guess, what are you seeing as being really exciting or important about engaging with people in that way?
Well, I'm not looked at as the TikTok guy. There's a couple of other people that have much bigger followings than I do that are ministers within the Church of Scotland who do great content too. But I think it's mainly just to show. Well, one of the things about Presbyterianism, especially Presbyterianism in Scotland, is they're not very good at talking about themselves positively. So they're not very good at promoting themselves or promoting the good work that they do. And coming from a background where I was raised Church of Scotland, I was baptized Church of Scotland, left it, and then found myself in non-denominational evangelical churches. One of the things that the evangelical churches like to do a lot is shout about themselves, talk about the things that they're doing. And so actually, I think that maybe just applying some of that to the really good work that's going on across the church that's often unnoticed, that's often not recognized, is really important. In my placements that I've done, I've met so many people, just incredible people that are in communities. They're just regular people that have full-time jobs that are volunteering with the churches that are doing so much for their communities in terms of helping the local homeless population or helping addicts or whatever it is, whatever the community work of that particular church is. There's just these incredible people that give of their time constantly. And I think people maybe have a perception about the Church of Scotland that might be true in some places, but my experience of it broadly has been very different from maybe the perception I had in my evangelical days. And coming back to it's felt very much like a kind of coming home, I suppose, which has been really positive. And I wish that as I was leaving the evangelical world that I had a voice that would be able to show that there was a different way of doing things, that there was actually a way of doing church that could be positive. And that's in no way to say that the Church of Scotland is perfect. It is far, far from it. But there's lots of great work, and I want to share that. And I love just talking with people. And when I was in Thailand at the WCRC, I didn't really post too much. I think I posted one video at the start and then a couple just afterwards, but I was gone for 2 weeks and I got this really encouraging comment where someone said, like, I was just thinking of you today. I hadn't seen your videos in a while and I missed it. And I think like I get met like dozens of messages almost every week from people who are just saying that they are reconnecting with faith, connecting with faith for the first time, who are just encouraged, or people who are doubting and have questions. And I think just providing an open and honest space to talk about that is important. And also just to show that not all forms of Christianity need to be terrible. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. No, I think that's a really worthwhile thing. I mean, we get a lot of similar comments, not a lot, some similar comments about the podcast too, where people are like, yeah, I don't know. I grew up Christian. It was awful, oppressive, and all these kinds of things. But like, you know, I can't escape it for some reason. So at least your podcast is helpful for figuring out what to do with it. I think there's a lot of really good value in that kind of content, especially as we're like, as we're there is like evangelicalism is still around. Don't get me wrong, but there was like a very big evangelical rise in the '90s and early 2000s, where evangelical Christianity was something that was foisted onto so many people. So having ways to manage that and come to terms with it in positive ways seems like a really good thing to me. Otherwise, I don't know. The deconstruction stuff is always so interesting to me for that very reason, because you've seen, sometimes you'll see people who go through that type of process and then they just become worse.
I think that's part of why I generally don't like using the term deconstruction anymore, but it's a really easy kind of term for people to maybe understand, that get an idea of what you're talking about. But I think for that exact same reason, like a lot of stuff that I see now that is labeled as deconstruction, I just find generally to be equally as toxic as the world that I left. But then also, like, one of the things that I found really enriching after I left that world was that I went on what I called an ecumenical adventure, and I went along to a Franciscan meeting, to a Catholic church, to an Orthodox service, Quaker meeting, Baptist churches, Presbyterian, all over, and just got a sense of, actually there can be good things that are found in all of these traditions. And actually, if you go back to some of the roots of even something like evangelicalism, you can see strong streams of social justice and things there too. And so the witness of something like the WCRC, the World Council of Churches, and hopefully the work of local churches too, in terms of ecumenical organizing, should be something where we draw the best from one another. But that's a challenge.
William, thanks so much for chatting with me about all the stuff. Very great to hear from you. Do you want to promote any of your things? Do you want to give some plugs?
Yeah, sure. So if you're wanting to stay connected with me on social media, the best places to go would be on TikTok and Instagram, which is at William Gibson GLA. And if you want to read my chapter on the experience of unionizing within Apple and reflecting on that theologically, then look at the book Awake, Emerging and Connected, edited by Victoria Turner. And if you want to maybe read some of my just general reflections on things that kind of come to me sporadically, I've recently started a Substack as well, which is just called the Space Between, which was the name of an old Instagram page that I used to use all the time to talk about deconstruction and things like that, but I've not really used it in a long time, but I still like the name. So that's the name of the new Substack, is the Space Between, or just search for William Gibson as well, and you should be able to find me. It's also linked in TikTok and Instagram, so if you find me there, you'll find the Substack too.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you join our Patreon, you can get an invite to our cool Patreon-only Discord channel where we talk about vegan recipes, swans that bite you, and some other stuff this week. We've also got a cool reading group going on in the Discord over Wim Carton and Andreas Malm's book, The Long Heat. So jump in while you can as we read through that book. It's been fun so far, so get involved. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Logical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.